Thank you for joining us today for this risk management webinar from Schnur. Please do remember that by attending today, you are eligible for 1 hour of continuing education credit through the AIA, or if you are an engineer, you are eligible for 1 hour of continuing education and will receive a certificate of completion from us to demonstrate proof of attendance. As you probably already noted, we at Schnur are expanding our scope of risk management offerings to include business enterprise risk topics related to the business of architecture and engineering. And this year is a very special year as we are celebrating our 60th anniversary of delivering insurance and risk management solutions to design professionals. In celebration of this milestone, we have recommitted ourselves to the design industry by going broader into business enterprise risk management topics that we believe would benefit you, our insureds, and your business. And we, of course, will continue to offer you risk management resources and webinars on traditional risk management topics to help you avoid claims and litigation. But we view our expanded topics, such as today's, will give us a deeper value add to you as being part of our Schnur program. So with that, we'll go ahead and get started. Uh-oh. For some reason, I'm sorry, hang on one second. For some reason, I'm not able to click to the next slide. It was working before. Oh, there we go. So with that, I'm going to introduce you to our speaker. Liz Farmer is a staff writer, finance reporter for Governing, and for those of you who may not know Governing, it's a national monthly magazine edited and published since 1987 in Washington, D.C. The magazine's focus is state and local government in the United States, and the magazine covers policy, politics, and the management of government enterprises. Its subject areas include government finance, land use, economic development, the environment, technology, and transportation. Liz, as I mentioned, as a staff writer and reporter, covers local budgets, pensions, and other public sector fiscal issues. I can tell you that I've personally been working with Governing for several years now, and the depth of Liz's knowledge and expertise is really impressive. Government finance as a topic is very complex because it's not just about numbers, it's also about the public good and public policy implications. And that is why we thought this subject would be a good one for us to explore further with someone who really knows her stuff. And we're so glad to have you, Liz, here today and that you've accepted our invitation to help us all become a little smarter in this subject matter and what the potential impacts are going to be on the design and construction industry. So quick note, we're going to leave some time at the very end for a discussion and questions. As you'll see in the bottom right-hand corner of the, there's a chat box. You can post any questions you'll have, and we'll try to reserve questions to the very end. But please do note to yourself any questions you have, especially since this is a complicated topic. And with that, I'm going to turn the slide deck over to Liz to talk a little bit about, we'll start first with a basic framework, Liz. If you could kind of give us an overlay of what the outlook is for current state and local government.
Sure. So the picture for state and local government has changed quite dramatically in the past decade or so, and obviously the financial crisis and the Great Recession had a lot to do with that. And the first slide deck is just to give you an idea of where the average state revenue growth was in the years preceding the Great Recession. And it was around annually, state and local governments, or state governments, their annual revenue growth, so like their annual income, would grow by about 5.5% on average every year. And clearly that's not a hard line. There's ups and downs. You can see that the 2001 recession took a bite out of that, that revenues declined, and that again in 2008 and 9 it was much worse and worse for longer for state and local governments. In the years following following the Great Recession, revenue growth has not ever been back up to 5.5% at all. I think the best year they had was somewhere close to 5% recently. But the average growth since the Great Recession in terms of state government income, in fact, revenue is just shy of 3%. And so in the years, when I first started writing about this, the question was, how long is this going to last? Is this a new era? Is this just a slow return to normal? And I can say as of, the last year or so, no one's asking that question anymore. Everyone has sort of resigned to the fact that economic growth, and for states, that means their revenue growth is just going to be slower and lower than it has been in the years past.
So this is the new normal.
Exactly.
Okay.
And then for cities, you can see this slide deck just shows, again, how different this past recession was compared with previous ones. And so you've had, cities in some ways are even more greatly affected by these things because it usually hits them deeper and it hits them harder and longer. And so, in the context of states, a lot of states have recovered their revenue, meaning they are earning now more than what they did before the recession. When you take inflation into account, cities, most of them still really haven't. And then when you look at...
Can I stop you there?
Yeah, sure.
Let's go back to that slide really quick. So basically what you're saying from this slide is that, you have a much more extended period of time before, so we haven't even quite gone back to pre-recession levels is what you're saying on this slide, right?
Yeah.
And then you mentioned that the cities take a harder hit. Can you unpack that a little bit? Why did the cities get impacted more?
Cities have less ability to raise their own revenue with tax increases. And the same goes for counties, too. I mean, I think maybe a lot of listeners know, anyone who owns a house knows that they pay property taxes. That is a huge source of county revenue, cities, tax income, sales. But the problem is, generally speaking, the lower you go in the government tier, the harder it is to get through a tax increase. And so for cities, when they are hit, and for them, state governments, again, it's like a totem pole. State governments tend to pass on any costs that they can't afford just on down to counties. Counties, then whatever it is they can't afford either, just pass those costs down on the cities. A good example is in the county I live in Montgomery County, Maryland, following the recession, the state, in 1 year to balance its budget, decided to start making the counties pay the annual bill for teacher pensions. And that was something the state had covered before. And it's pretty common for states to pay for all teachers' pensions in the state and not pass that cost on to counties, even though the school systems are run by the counties. But in Maryland, the state just was facing yet another budget shortfall, and so passed on all that cost to the counties. So now the counties suddenly have this big bill that they've never had before, that they're going to have for, in perpetuity. And so then typically what happens is the counties will, make some cuts that then affect cities. And so cities are often left, it's like a game of hot potato, and cities are left holding the bag. And cities are also charged with providing a lot of the services that we interact with on a daily and weekly basis, like trash pickup and those kinds of things, filling potholes. And so they're very service-oriented, and they have the least flexibility in what they can do with the money they get.
Got it. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you.
And so I always forget to include good news when I talk about this stuff, so I threw this slide in here at the last minute. And so the good news is that a lot of places have adjusted to this slower growth era. And in doing so, I think the Great Recession was a big lesson for obviously everybody, but for governments, it was kind of a smack to the face as to how bad it can really get really quickly. And many places were unprepared in terms of their savings to really cover any budget shortfall of any significance. And so what states, and this goes for cities too, this just shows the states, but states have what's called rainy day funds, so they also have other kind of, basically like, we call them funds, but it's kind of like bank accounts, like you have your savings account or your 401k, and you have resources available to you that you can pull from in times of need. And so this graph reflects basically states that have, where states are in terms of the resources they can pull from in times of need. And so if you are basically a blue or white state, you're in pretty good shape. If you're any other color, except Oklahoma is in red, today was not available, but if you're any other color, then you're on shaky ground. And so
you're just not prepared for another recession.
Right.
Those are the states that should be most concerned.
Yeah. And so like the next recession is, the Great Recession in 08 and 09 was just a complete, it was hopefully a once in a generation thing. The next one's not going to be that bad. But it will require states to use some savings, and it will require budget cuts and all of that stuff. Yep. And so this just kind of gives you a picture of, I mentioned sort of this new era and constrained spending, and one of the things that governments don't have much control over is sort of their hard costs, like debt. Any outstanding bond debt. You have to pay that. That's legal. You can't skip those payments. Pension payments, although governments do tend to skip them because nobody's holding them to it, they still owe a bill eventually. So that in effect is kind of like skipping a credit card payment. Like it just makes your bill higher. You still owe the money. And then so that's something else that factors into here that's sort of weighing down on budgets. Medicaid costs are growing. That's another thing that weighs down on state budgets. And so this top line that you see that's growing reflects all of those things. I got this from Moody's Analytics, and it's a really helpful slide. And so you can see that particularly since the recession, all of the spending is the stuff that we really care about, like teachers, schools, those potholes I mentioned. I mean, all of the stuff, the services that really are how people interact with in their governments day-to-day, building, construction, all those things. That line is really not growing very much at all. And so this is sort of kind of gives you the picture of where states are in terms of what kind of flexibility they have with their day-to-day cash. And then this is sort of like a warning shot. So I kind of painted this picture of less flexibility, slower growth. Sorry about that. And so this sort of just shows the blue bars. This shows kind of what happens when states are faced with lower than expected revenues, and they have to make cuts in their budget to compensate for that. And so obviously these peaks are when we've had recessions. There was a 91 recession, there's a 2001 recession, and a 2008 recession. And you can see the 2008 recession, that 41, the blue bar, that is the number of states that had to cut their budget. The following year, 39 states had to make a budget cut. The green line is the dollar figure, the total dollar figure in budget cuts. So you can see, again, how different and how bad it was in 2008, but for governments, it's really like 2009 and 10, the years that they were really affected. The total money that had to be cut from budgets was double what it was the last time, and eyeballing it looks like about triple what it was in 1991. So these are all adjusted for inflation. So this really shows you the magnitude of pain, really, that governments had to deal with. And it shows 19 for fiscal year 2016. We're right now in fiscal year 2017. It's about to close in about a month or so. And about half of states have had to make budget cuts again. So that number is on the rise. The green line, not so bad. It's going up. I mean, the budget cuts aren't huge magnitudes. A lot of it is the oil prices, and the oil states are struggling with that. So they're kind of pushing that up a little bit. But lots of states, Connecticut's had to make budget cuts. I mean, there's lots of states across the country are dealing with a little bit slower revenue growth than they thought they were going to have this year.
So just looking back at that, taking a high-level view of the chart, as you look at the blue graph, the blue bars, those are the states those are the states who had to make cuts, or the number of states who had to make cuts, and you can see those peaks. And then you overlay that with the green line, and that says how much, the intensity or severity of those cuts.
Exactly.
You can see it was a much steeper situation in the past recession.
Right.
I was going to ask you really quickly, you said a moment ago that you didn't anticipate, or I don't want to put words in your mouth, but you didn't anticipate that there would be as severe a recession in the future, at least hopefully not. Are you hearing in your circles that's sort of what may be the case, that there will be another corrective recession in the near future, but not necessarily, there's no signs it'll be more severe? Because I'm hearing, you hear these, the gold, people who are investing in gold and all that.
Yeah.
And there's some real concern and alarm about what this next recession is going to look like. So not just when it will happen, but like how severe it will be. Can you tell us a little bit more about your experience on that?
Yeah. So I talked to a number of economists, and they'll probably be the first to say that their ability to predict things is about the same as the ability of the weather guy to get stuff right. So it's, you can almost, and they're obviously very educated, but almost take what they say with a grain of salt if they ever predict anything that's, hardline that's going to happen, because chances are they'll be wrong. But so when you're talking about recessions, it's almost like playing the odds. So, and by that I mean a recession happens, I think on average once every 7 years, and so we are about, we're more than 7 years now since the last recession ended. So, if you just look at the math, then the natural inclination is to think, okay, we're living on borrowed time. We're due, air quotes, due for a recession. But, and I just heard Dan White from Moody's Analytics said this last week to me, and he said, just because the math plays out, just because you're due for a recession doesn't mean it's going to happen.
Okay.
Right?
Okay.
So there's that. I mean, yes, odds are that in the next 3 years we'll be in some sort of economic contraction. And I haven't talked to anybody who thinks it's going to be as bad as it was in 2008. A lot of things had to happen and come together and fall apart for all of that to happen in 2008. Typically recessions, if you were to look at this big graph that I don't have here, but if you look at a big chart over the last century, there was the Great Depression and there was the Great Recession, and then all the other ones, aside from maybe the 1970s, have been kind of like, have been dips on some form or another that the economy has recovered from at a fairly quick basis. Okay. So yes, we're going to have another recession probably in the next 3 years, but I can't tell you when, and I can't tell you how bad. I can tell you with some certainty that it's not going to be like 2008 was.
Okay, that's good to know. So, I'd asked Liz to kind of also provide us with a kind of an overview of, or an overlay, I should say, of the federal government's role in all of this. So could you kind of walk us through the role of the federal government and what the implications are there? We're hearing a lot, of course, in the news. Every day seems to be one calamity or another at the federal level. So help us understand a little bit more about what all that stuff means at the state and local level.
Okay, so I mentioned that totem pole before, where states pass on costs down to lower governments, et cetera, and at the top of the totem pole is the federal government. And so while the federal government can't necessarily tell states what to do with everything, they do influence, they do have a great deal, I guess, of influence in terms of when the federal government wants to make cuts. Usually it means passing off money, passing those cuts down onto the states. And so this circle graph kind of shows when states spend money every year, some of that money is from their own general fund revenue. That's the revenue they get from their own resources, tax revenue, fees, that kind of thing. So that's like their own revenue that they generated. States also go to the bond market and sell bonds to get money to pay for stuff, and so that's the 2% you see there. There are other kind of separate funds, as I mentioned before, like we have different funds that we use to pay for things as individuals, so do states. Typically these funds are dedicated, like transportation funds or other kinds of things. So that is that's the gray, and then the almost 1/3 of the rest of the money that states spend comes from federal government giving them money. Most, or a little more than half of that, is straight up Medicaid money. So Medicaid works currently, because they haven't changed it yet, Medicaid works on a matching basis. So whatever states spend on their Medicaid programs, that's healthcare for the poor, governments match it dollar for dollar. And so that's why that's where a lot of that comes from. Governments also give states a lot of money for education purposes, mostly K through 12. So a good chunk of it comes for that as well, and then states distribute that to counties and localities. So, and then the rest of it's kind of a hodgepodge of other things. But you can see how much there that as the top says, why federal certainty is so important. If you can think of if your own budget, if there was a third of there was some source that you rely on for a third of your spending for people in your life who need it, and you're not quite sure what that amount is going to be from year to year, and especially this year and the coming years, that is very anxiety-producing. And so states right now, most of them, their fiscal years start in July. They're finalizing or trying to finalize their, fiscal 2018 budgets. And so when you're in the budget crunch and not knowing where a third of your spending is going to be, that is really tough to plan around. And so all that kind of sets up how the federal government's, money kind of impacts states directly. But then there's this larger picture of federal tax reform. And we've heard the candidate, President Trump, talk about this. We've been hearing Republicans on the Hill talk about this for years now. And the feeling is now that there's a Republican in the White House. Former President Obama wanted tax reform, but he was a Democrat, so he wanted to do it in a different way than those in control of Congress wanted to do it. So the thinking has been, now that there's a Republican in the White House and Republicans are still in control of Congress, tax reform is going to happen. And so generally what people wanted to do with tax reform is to make the tax code simpler by not having so many categories for income earners. Right now we have more than half of a dozen income brackets for people. You have different brackets for corporations. You have, some people call them loopholes that corporations can take. There are deductions. There's all kinds of things you can do when you're filing your taxes to manipulate the income that you actually declare. And so tax reform theoretically takes away a lot of that, and then takes away a lot of those manipulations that you can do, makes fewer categories of income earners, so fewer tax brackets. So it just kind of takes away a lot of the garbage, and then lowers tax rates to accommodate for that. Because if you're going to take away my, mortgage interest deduction, then all of a sudden my income that I declare is higher, and I want to lower tax rates, so I'm not paying you more money. And so that's sort of the idea. These two charts show basically a lot of states link their definition of a corporation and their definition of income earners to what the federal tax code defines. Okay. So the federal tax code has 7 different brackets. A lot of states have the same 7 different brackets for income earners. And so all this is to say that if you look at these, and if you are in a blue state or a green state, you are very closely aligned with the federal tax code definition for income earners, for corporate tax code income. So that means that if the federal government makes any changes to its definition of a corporation, or its definition of a deduction, or its definition of a low income earner, all of those things, then it automatically kicks into the state. And so all of a sudden the state needs to look at, wait a minute, my definition just changed. Am I going to get, what's going to happen with my tax rate for that group? Is my revenue going to go up or down? So this is all to say that most of the country is very closely linked to whatever the federal government does. So if the federal government makes a change, these states are also going to have to take a look at their own tax code and decide what they're going to do about it. So again, it's like talking about uncertainty. This means a lot of uncertainty for these states as they wait for the federal government to do tax reform if they're going to do it.
And so, I'll stop you there. So if I'm summarizing what you said, and before this call, we kind of talked a little bit about Wall Street's response to the presidency, and you and I kind of talked about I was a bit surprised that there had been a positive reaction on Wall Street to the presidency, because I thought there would be more disruption. So essentially what you're saying there is that because we are, the likely reason for there being not as much disruption on Wall Street, at least to now, is that because we have a Republican president, Republican Congress, in theory, things are going to happen and get done because there'll be less gnashing teeth, and people should be on the same page, right?
Right, should.
And
keyword.
Right. And so what you're saying is, so what we were saying before is that was so initially Wall Street probably had a positive feeling about, okay, things are going to get done, there's some predictability here, we can kind of count on there being some tax reform. And now, based on your experience, based on what just happened with the health care bill, your take on it is what?
That things are not going to happen quickly. Or put another way, things still happen slowly in Washington. And so, yes, there was a generally positive reaction to the Trump presidency, particularly from the business side. I think, in retrospect, not surprisingly, because he is obviously seen as pro-business, so are the Republicans. And I think a lot of businesses want to see tax reform because right now it is very complicated. A lot of companies keep their profits overseas because many feel that the tax rate here is too high. And so there's a lot of kind of manipulation that goes on, particularly with businesses, to avoid either getting taxed at all or getting taxed at rates that are higher here than they would elsewhere. So I think I would say most people do want a simpler tax code. And so there was a belief that things were going to start moving along. I remember being at a session for the National Conference of State Legislatures. I think it was right before Trump took the oath, so it was sometime in early January, and this guy was convinced that the ACA would be repealed by March, that tax reform was going to happen before the midterm elections, and that all these things were going to happen, faster than you could ever believe, especially if you've been following anything in Washington for the last 7 years. And I don't think, and nobody's talking that way anymore. I think what happened with the failure of the ACA repeal is that it shows that it's still that the Republican Party is still very there are still factions in the Republican Party that want very extreme changes, and that there isn't a consensus enough on that side, even when you have a Republican in the White House, to get the votes that they need to make something happen. So that kind of showed everyone that they need to slow their roll, basically.
Yeah. Okay.
And so the next couple of slides, I think, are going to just talk about some of the proposed changes. I mentioned simplifying, the income tax code, for example. So that means currently there are 7, I think, tax brackets for income earners, depending on how much you earn a year. And so this will consolidate that down to 3. This is something proposed. Again, the House Republicans have proposed a plan. I think it's called the Better Way. Trump, as a candidate and as the president, has outlined certain things. And so the next couple of slides kind of attempt to show what's on the table. And so this shows, again, how individual income tax brackets under the Trump plan would be consolidated down to 3. And so, again, at the state, all of a sudden your own tax brackets are being consolidated down. You've got to figure out if you're going to, keep the same tax rate or not. And then, again, qualified capital gains, that's investment earnings. There will be a lower tax rate on that. It's a little complicated. I won't get into it.
Okay.
I'm just going to say it's going to be lower. And then this, I did something funky with the font just to show. So I mentioned those deductions as a way to lower your income that you declare to the federal government or the state government. There's a lot of talk of eliminating a lot of them. I think the mortgage interest one, actually, because home ownership is so valued in this country, I don't think that one is not even on the table.
Okay.
So if you own a house, don't worry about that. But state income or sales taxes, people deduct. If you live in a state that doesn't have an income tax, then you can deduct your sales taxes from your income, if you want to do that math.
I was going to say, boy, that would be a task.
I don't know how to do that, but right now, I can deduct the state income that I pay to Maryland for my federal declared. The reason that I made this in larger fonts is just to kind of show the impact. So state income or sales taxes eliminating that deduction then raises the declarable taxable income that somebody can have to pay, has to declare to the federal government, and therefore the federal government gets a little bit more money to tax. That accounts for like 3/4 of this what the federal revenue, what the federal government would get in increased revenue.
Okay.
Because of these, eliminating these deductions. So that one is a biggie. It's a biggie for the federal government, but it's also a biggie for the states because they want their constituents to be able to keep that.
Is there some real traction that you're hearing on that?
It's just one of those things that constantly on the table. It's interesting because it's not, it doesn't have an immediate impact in terms of, at least for the state government. Obviously, there's an immediate impact for the taxpayer. But for states, you know, it doesn't have an immediate impact in the sense that it's not like it's taking any money away from states right now.
Mm-hmm.
But the criticism of this deduction is that if you are a state that has really high taxes,
mm-hmm.
then your taxpayers are deducting more, like, really high taxes from the income they declare to the federal government. So some say that this deduction makes the federal government almost subsidize higher tax rates in these states, because taxpayers in these high tax states are deducting a lot of income
mm-hmm.
that they declare. And so when you take that away, theoretically it limits these high tax states from raising their taxes anymore, because they are no longer, air quotes, getting that sort of weird subsidy in effect. I'm not sure how much stock I put in that, but that is the concern. And then as you can see, like, property and real estate taxes are also obviously very significant. And then but you know, medical, any of these kind of nitpicky, not nitpicky to everybody, but nitpicky deductions, they would just be eliminated. So in effect, the income you declare to the federal government would then be higher. Same thing for businesses. Again, this is, I'm glad you sent these slides out ahead of time, particularly for this one. I'm going to try and simplify this as much as possible, but for businesses, the way that they want to kind of change things, this is not the full list, but this is the highlights. So the full expensing of capital investments right now, when you buy something, a building, a printer, whatever it is, you have to deduct the value of it over time. And so that would change that so that you can write off or deduct that investment the same year you bought it, like all at once. And so the theory is that sort of encourages more purchasing,
mm-hmm.
You know, that kind of thing. Elimination of the deduction for net interest expense from income. In effect, this just makes it's almost, you know, you can equate it to the personal, to the interest that someone pays on their student loans or interest you pay on your mortgage as an individual. You know, businesses pay interest, and so they would no longer be able to deduct that interest from their income. Mm-hmm. So no residual tax on foreign profits. This is, again, it's kind of weird, but so this line, this is designed to encourage companies not to basically have tax shelters mm-hmm. overseas. And so they don't want to bring their foreign profits back to the U.S. because then they get taxed at the U.S.'s corporate tax rate, and they don't like that. You know, and they can deduct whatever they've paid abroad, but it's still, you know, many companies feel the corporate tax rate here is too high, so they just keep those profits abroad. So this would basically encourage them to not do that.
And on that, are there some values? Do we have a sense of how much that would be?
It's in the trillions, so it's a lot of money.
Okay.
There's a group that is really kind of all over this called it's ITET. I can't remember what the acronym stands for.
Okay.
ITET.
Mm-hmm.
But they have a ton of data on this if anyone's interested in looking at that more.
Okay.
And then the border adjustment tax. I think this may be the one that's most been talked about. And again, this basically encourages production at home. And this would, if you produce stuff abroad for cheaper, then you're going to be taxed on it when you try and bring it back to the U.S. If you produce stuff here and want to sell it abroad, you're not going to be taxed on it at the U.S. rate anyway. And so, again, this encourages production at home. I have heard that some feel that this would not actually do that as it's intended because, again, there's so many moving parts here, but many people feel as the U.S. dollar gets stronger that it would still be cheaper in the long run to produce stuff abroad because the dollar is, you know, will buy more abroad, and they'll just take the tax hit and bring it on home and still come out ahead. So there's a big question as to whether this border adjustment tax would actually do what it intends to do. And so kind of getting back to that whole how are states connected to the federal tax code. Pew did a study a while ago. The Tax Foundation did one more recently. They basically say the same thing, is that if these proposed changes were to go through, and that's a big if, but the proposals on the table that I kind of just outlined, the net result would be that states would actually see an increase in their revenue because if they don't change their own tax rates. So a good kind of case study to look at for like what might happen in the next 4 or 5 years here is when they did tax reform in 1986. That was the last time the federal government did anything significant in terms of the federal tax code, and that greatly impacted states. And what happened there is a lot of states went back and had to lower their tax rates so that their citizens weren't paying like suddenly way more money in state taxes.
Oh, okay.
Most of them had to do that. Some actually just pocketed the cash because they were in a budget crisis. And then some actually had to raise their tax rates because their specific structure was that they were going to get less money. And so this sort of just, if you're looking through the words on these slides, this just kind of gives you an idea of what might be in store for your own state government as if and when federal tax reform does happen. And so kind of wrapping it up in a big bow, let me go back to this one first, is that there is just, again, I mentioned that kind of constrained fiscal picture for government. There's also this sort of waiting game that state governments particularly are doing with the federal government as we wait to see if anything is going to happen. So, and it's, nobody thought anything was going to happen while President Obama was in office. So now it's kind of this even more heightened expectation of what's going to happen and when. And then what are we going to do about it? And then as we've kind of gone over this, but the AHCA failed, but that doesn't mean that there aren't going to be huge changes to Medicaid somewhere down the line. And again, Medicaid is something that takes up, I think I have it on here actually, yeah, 15% of state budgets. And then again, a lot of money they get from the federal government is also dedicated towards Medicaid. So this is a huge chunk of what states spend every year. Even though, like I said, even though the effort failed this year to change, to repeal Obamacare, there is still a desire to do something about Medicaid because, you can see on the next slide, this gives you an idea of the top line is basically what federal Medicaid is, what the federal government is going to spend on Medicaid, not in the past and then in the future. It is a line that is just, energetically going up. If the AHCA had gone through that split off, the lighter blue line shows what their expenditures would have been. And so you can see that huge gap. I mean, that's really appealing. I mean, Medicaid costs, everyone is projecting as people get older, and Medicaid pays for people who are poor and can't afford their own health care, but also there's the Medicaid expansion due to the ACA, and then also people who are retired but live in poverty also are in Medicaid. So you have people living longer in that group, in the cost of health care. So there's all these things kind of working against or for, depending on what your point of view is, towards Medicaid costs just increasing. And so this, what has always been perplexing to me is why there isn't more discussion about how do we make things cost less, not how do we just pay less money. Mm-hmm. But right now the federal government and pretty much all the governments are looking at how to pay less money. And so the Y block grant Medicaid is because of that lighter blue line right there. It controls the cost. It's not, much more than what they're projected to spend now. And just to go back to this slide, as I mentioned before, currently Medicaid is like a match program. They spend $1, they get $1 from the federal government. What many Republicans in Congress want to do is to completely eliminate that match idea and then just have Medicaid funding turn into a per enrollee basis. So you get X number of dollars per person in your Medicaid program, and the federal government gives that to you every year. And then the per dollars, what you get per enrollee is tied to, grows every year, and it's tied to what I said there. There's a medical CPI plus 1 percentage point. It's a little nitty-gritty, but basically that money grows every year. The problem is the way that was laid out, it means that states are going to eventually get less and less money every year than they would have if it was just a dollar match program.
Right.
So again, the totem pole, federal government, is a nice blue line, but it doesn't mean that healthcare is actually costing less. So states would have to decide, are we going to spend more money now on Medicaid? Are we going to pass that on down to counties? What are we going to do? Are we just going to kick people off of Medicaid? So there's gaps upon gaps when you look at things like that.
Yeah. And I think this is what you're going to talk about next, but so the implications here for maybe construction, infrastructure, can you kind of tease that out a little bit?
What does Medicaid have to do with construction? Well, of course, on the face it doesn't, but this is all part of this big picture of the changing face of government. So all of those big scary things I was just talking about, those are generally on the blue line. Everything else is the orange line, so construction. And going, debt is a blue line thing, but basically the flexibility that states and cities have to spend on all those other things is much less. So I guess the point of all this is that governments have less fiscal flexibility than they ever have. And actually this previous slide is a pretty good example when you're looking at infrastructure, how little governments are spending on things that really matter to people. And so obviously in the 50s and 60s, that was the interstate highway building. That's a bit of an anomaly. Nobody expects the numbers to be like that. And this is the percent of GDP, spending. So, but then, around the, 70s and 80s, it wasn't that bad, but you can see we're at pretty much all-time lows now. And there is no plan to really, there's talk of a plan, but there's no plan to have that go up at any time. And so, you can see a bit of a blip there from some of the spending from some of the recession-era programs that the federal government had, like Build America bonds.
2009, is that what you're saying, 2009, 2010?
Yeah, so there was a little blip up, but pretty much since then, it has gone way down.
Yep.
And that is a reflection of the fact that, again, that blue and orange line, states are so weighed down with all these obligations that they have that they are afraid to go into more debt, and that means less building. And so it all kind of connects. I mean, the less flexibility states have in terms of what they're getting every year and money that they can spend on their constituents and on government services in general, the more it impacts all of us who look to government to provide us with these services.
Yeah, I'm hoping at the end of this we'll maybe hear from some folks who are on the call who can maybe tell us on the ground what they're seeing in terms of construction, either on the boards, it being planned, or actually maybe being sidelined. I don't know. I'd like to hear, if we can, from those on the call.
That'd be great.
So I guess, I think we can, or did you have another slide? Did you want?
No, I think, well, it was an as-needed slide,
okay.
So I don't need to show it.
So I have a question for you, and we kind of sort of talked about it before this call, but so what are the things that if you had a magic wand that you could influence what the federal government does that's going to help state and local governments, be healthy, I guess, fiscally healthy. What are the three big things that you would recommend? And I ask you this because it's possible that some folks on the call may be working, they may have political contacts, they may want to work at the state level on some of these issues, but I guess my question is more on the federal level, but still, I guess if you had a magic wand, what would be the three top things that you would recommend happening to really help stabilize state and local government?
Okay. So one thing would be to just kind of end this question of can we tax online sales? And I guess that's states are losing money every year to to purchases that are online by constituents in their borders that are from another company out of state. This goes back to the 1992 Supreme Court decision, which I won't get into, but for the last several decades, the internet has exploded in terms of a place to shop, and the sales taxes haven't been keeping up because there's that legal question of whether or not states can collect a sales tax from a retailer outside its borders. Amazon has been going around as of late making deals with states, and so and that plus there is a court case in South Dakota that directly challenges this notion that states can't tax out-of-state retailers. So I do think that question is going to be answered in the courts one way or the other. But the federal government has cost states billions of dollars every year by not addressing this sooner. And so that is one huge area where states could immediately start collecting way more money than they normally do.
And you say way more money, like how much do you think?
Sorry, I didn't mean that.
Okay.
I should have it memorized, but it's in the. I can look it up really quick.
No, that's okay.
Okay.
It's a lot of money. You're talking something that's substantial that could really even out some of the gaps that we're talking about?
Yeah,
okay.
It would at least, the sales tax base is shrinking to the states. So
you know what? Touch on that really quick.
Sure.
How is that happening?
So we've gone to that. There's that last slide. So we've gone from a primarily goods economy since the sales tax was established, to a primarily services economy. Services, generally speaking, are not taxed. And so that's when the people say the sales tax base is shrinking, this picture kind of gives you an idea of what that looks like. And that means that there are fewer purchases that people make that states and localities in some cases can collect the sales tax on. And so they have tended to respond to that by raising the rate, which places a greater burden on lower income people because they are now paying significantly. It places a greater burden on lower income people because when you pay $1 out of 10, that's a huge amount of money to someone who is low income versus $100 out of $1,000. So when you look at it like that, it's significant. So and that's why people say the sales tax is regressive. It places a greater burden on people who don't earn as much. And progressive would then be the other way. And so there's a move in some states, most notably North Carolina, to tax services and capture a greater chunk of what people are actually spending. They are constantly lobbied against. And, I think in some cases there are not services that should be taxed, and in some cases there are. What would be nice is if there were just a national definition, so there would be no question. This is something that perhaps Congress could and should take up, but they're not going to. And the idea is that, yes, the sales tax is a regressive tax, but if you do expand it to services, generally for people who are lower income aren't going to the auto mechanic because they don't have a car. They take the bus. And so a lot of these services capture expenditures that are more indicative of wealthier, or at least middle-class people. And so the Tax Foundation, which is very, either centrist or right-leaning, actually advocates for expanding the sales tax to services and then lowering the rate to make it a little more fair. And so, but again, this is something that has been very difficult to do for a very long time. Governments have been trying to do this and failing for decades. So I don't know how they're going to do it, but that is something that would help their pocketbooks.
So when you say definition, there are ways to define it so that it's fair across certain services. I know that's a pretty contentious issue with architectural engineering services. Is there a way to do it so that firms who have passed, let's just take an architect, for example. An architect would typically on a project retain, a mechanical engineer, structural engineer, and subconsultants, right? Or, same thing happens on the engineering side. But so, you don't want to have those double tax situations. So are there ways out there that you've heard a solution to solve that you could expand a tax to services but not create that pyramid problem?
People have talked about a value-added tax. I don't think that that's something that would ever fly here that attempts to address that, but what I think North Carolina is probably a good example to look to, because it is obviously, I mean, it's North Carolina, it's a fiscally conservative state, yet they still have managed to do this. So I think the way that we could do it here in the U.S. with the values that we have is to just limit, you know, we're not going to tax every service, but like auto mechanics.
So you're talking about like the simpler services where you don't have downstream services.
Exactly, where it's pretty straight up, you know, you're taxing the labor.
Yeah.
You know, we already taxed the parts, so now you're going to tax the labor, that kind of thing.
The simpler administrative kind of thing.
Yeah, not where you're employing a whole bunch of other people.
Gotcha.
But yeah, the more, like you said, the more straight up stuff. I mean, that's pretty straightforward.
Okay.
And
is that what North Carolina did? I'm sorry, I'm not familiar with their instruction.
They've expanded it to, I can't remember specifically which services, but I think auto mechanics is one of them.
Okay.
And I think haircuts too. Haircuts tends to be salons. That tends to be another popular one that's relatively easy to do. You know, but then again, you run a little bit into the, well, is this still very regressive? You know, with anything with tax policy, yes, you're doing it to earn money, but you're also there's a reason they call it policy. It's like, what are you saying about what you value in your state? Who are you trying to protect, and that kind of thing. So there's a lot to think about when you look at tax and services and what you should tax.
So when did North Carolina pass this?
They did this, I think it was 2012 or 13 is when they started the first wave.
Okay.
And this was also in conjunction with income tax cuts. So again, it was just very much helped the case for expanding the tax to services. A lot of other states have tried to do that. Generally, conservative states have tried to lower the income tax by then expanding the sales tax to services. What has typically then happened in those places is they lower the income tax a little bit and then raise the sales tax rate, which does nothing to help the regressivity of the tax. So, and income tax cuts in general tend to benefit wealthier people than they do poorer people because the benefit is numbers-wise greater.
Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
So I think I cut you off. I'd asked you what you would do with your magic wand. So if I'm hearing you correctly, your magic wand would be online sales tax, right?
Yeah.
With the services tax, expanding the services, the second thing?
Yeah, expanding the services. And then investing more in grant programs that encourage infrastructure maintenance and repair. These are the not sexy things that we really, 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 really need to spend money on. Everybody loves a ribbon cutting and a shiny new building, but we need to repair that bridge that's about to fall apart. We need to invest in more sustainable energy and things like that. And so the federal government has had some things, particularly during the Great Recession, that funneled a lot of money to states to jumpstart these projects. Because of the time constraints, a lot of them were kind of the short-sighted projects, like repaving a road or restriping and things like that. But President Obama had this proposal called qualified public infrastructure bonds that was basically an expansion of the tax-exempt bonds. It would allow.
Are you talking about muni bonds?
Yeah, muni bonds.
Okay.
It basically, long story short, it would make it cheaper for states to work with private companies to build infrastructure projects or to add on, to do an airport expansion, things like that are really needed to grow an economy. It would create this new kind of classification of bonds, or it would expand a classification of bonds to make it cheaper to finance those projects.
Okay. So you would advocate then for QPIBs?
QPIBs, yeah.
QPIBs. Can you tell us a little bit about, I'm going to mess this up, BABs?
Yes.
Okay.
Build America Bonds.
Yeah.
That was a great idea. And it was a really popular program. They launched it in 2009. And that was one of those things. So the municipal market is primarily tax-exempt bonds, meaning that the investor, when they get earnings on those bonds every year, they get their investment income based on whatever the rate is on those bonds. They don't have to. they don't get taxed on that as income. That's like tax-free income. So
right.
It's very popular with wealthy people who can dump a lot of money into these bonds and not get taxed on the earnings,
yep.
And funds and stuff like that. But that tax exemption doesn't apply to everybody. It doesn't apply to pension funds, for example, or anybody who lives, any foreign investors.
Oh, okay.
So muni bonds are not really that popular with those kinds of investors. What BABs were is they were taxable bonds that were issued in the municipal market. And so it opened up the market to these new investors, and so that was a good thing. And then, but the bad thing about taxable bonds is that because the investor is getting taxed on that, you got to give them a higher tax rate to kind of make it worth their while, or you got to give them a higher investment earnings rate on that bond to make it worth their while. So that means that you're issuing bonds that are like 5 or 6% interest rate versus 3 or 4%.
Gotcha.
So that means that it's more expensive to pay back the debt on those bonds. So to compensate for that, the federal government gave subsidies to states to pretty much cover that extra cost.
Mm-hmm.
And so it was, a total wash for states. They were issuing this debt and basically paying the same as they would have if they were tax-free bonds. But they were selling this to new investors. And so
which is a good thing, right? Because you're getting more money and you're getting more access to,
Yeah, and more demand, theoretically even lowered the rate and all that stuff. There's a whole economics thing that we could get into, but so they were generally seen as a good thing for all those reasons. You brought new investors into the market. It didn't cost states any more than it had before. That is until 2013 when sequestration kicked in. And this is something that it doesn't seem like anybody really thought ahead to. But when sequestration kicked in, it affected a ton of programs, including those subsidies that the federal government gave to states to offset the extra costs of those bonds, the Build America bonds. So the subsidies didn't go away entirely, but they were cut. And so that meant that states now had to pay more on the interest rate on their bonds. They weren't getting covered fully by the federal government anymore.
Oh, okay.
So all of a sudden they had millions more dollars in years in every year that they were paying in interest that they just hadn't accounted for. So everyone hailed the BABS program as a great example of what you can do when you open up the municipal market to new investors, but it kind of backfired when the federal government reneged on what it said it was going to do.
Gotcha. Is that at all have you heard that are any of these bond proposals potentially in this Trump package?
Trump's economic advisors have spoken highly of Build America bonds. They've talked about them as a great tool. So I don't think, no new president is going to name anything the same thing that his predecessor did. But I wouldn't be surprised if you see something like that proposed in whenever he does come out with infrastructure spending package.
Okay, great. I think we have, I have another question, but I think I want to open it up to see if there are any questions from the audience. Jillian, can you tell us if anybody's asked any questions, or if anybody wants to maybe give us an update on what's happening on the ground in terms of funding?
We do have 2 questions that came in.
Oh, great.
The first one is, are there any federal, state, or local total manpower or total compensation history summaries available, including annualized pension costs? And they prefer graphics if they are available.
There is a great source called the Public Plans, I think it's publicplansdata.org. It is by the Center for Retirement Research, and I go to it all the time. So if you Google Boston College BRR, that'll probably get you there. Or I'm pretty sure their data website is publicplansdata.org. And they have a very easy, clickable interface where you can go to your own state and just quickly see graphics and lines and charts, which I really love, clearly. That's what my presentation was. So that is a fabulous resource in terms of you can get a national picture on total pensions and pension debt, and then state by state, and then even plan by plan if you're interested in that as well.
Great.
Oh, and the U.S. Census tracks state and local government employment. The interface isn't as lovely, but if you go to the Census Bureau, they also track that. And if you also go to governing.com/data, we also track the state and local government employee population as well.
Great, thank you.
Other questions?
So much of how infrastructure is built in this country is from, financed by municipal bonds. And so I came away from that seminar basically thinking, okay, so there wasn't anything I was missing. It's all even still a big mystery to the experts. I mean, the kind of line that we kept hearing is, here is the plan in terms of what Trump wants to do. He wants to do more P3s and all of that, but there still has been no discussion of where exactly that money is coming from.
Okay.
Hi guys, my phone disconnected me if you want the other question.
Yeah, go ahead.
Sorry. Has anyone ever defined what necessary expenditures are actually required and which are constitutionally defined for the federal, state, and local governments?
So the federal government does have mandated expenditures, and I think it's even called, there's discretionary spending and non-discretionary spending is how it's often referred to. States have, it's not necessarily in the Constitution in terms of what they have to pay and what they can't, but it is legal in terms of, like a bond offering is a legal document. It says the state is going to pay X, Y, Z. Pensions are protected in the state constitution as an obligation that the state will pay X, Y, Z to the retirees. So it's not like it's all in one place at the state level, but there are legal and constitutional protections around certain kinds of payments, most notably bond payments and pension payments. And then in terms of kind of the other mandatory stuff, like retiree health care for states, it really is very much state by state in terms of what the legal protections are for those. And again, for Medicaid, states, obviously have to pay Medicaid, but states certainly make cuts to Medicaid, and so the kind of two I mentioned, there are specific legal protections, but when you get beyond the federal government level to state and local governments, it is a maze in terms of consistency. There absolutely is not, basically.
Okay. Fair enough.
We had two other questions come in if you want to extend the time.
Go ahead. Absolutely. Let's go.
Okay. How much will the new tax law make for small businesses in large states?
How much will the new tax law make?
Right. How much will the new tax laws make for small businesses?
Well, I mean, if you're talking about tax reform, the idea that many have about tax reform is that it should be revenue neutral, meaning that it won't cost any more, it won't cost any less. So while tax rates may go down, you could see other perks that you get when you are declaring your income that also go away, like some of that stuff I mentioned. But generally speaking, when you're looking at businesses in tax reform, historically, and again, what we're looking at here is that it's aimed at bringing down the cost of doing business in the U.S. Whether or not that actually plays out is, kind of TBD, but that's the goal. When you're talking about simplification, a lot of times that is code for, making it cheaper to do business here, encourage production abroad, and all of that stuff. So that's the idea, but it really, really, really depends on the execution. And then it also depends on what your local government laws are, too.
And And we still haven't seen anything.
Exactly.
Yeah, so it's hard to, we're kind of, all of this is theoretical at this point until we actually see something come through. An actual bill to read and then see the numbers associated with it, right? Okay, go ahead, Jill. I think, Jillian, sorry, I think there was another question.
Yes, I think it looks like this may be an extension to the one I just asked. It says, what impact will this have on liability insurance rates across the board?
Oh boy, we wouldn't be able to respond to that because we don't even know yet what this is, what this even looks like. But I guess that would be a TBD at this point.
For sure.
Yep. All right. Well, we have, I think, hit our mark. In fact, we're 6 minutes over. I want to thank everyone for joining us today. I think, especially Liz, thank you so much for joining us and providing kind of a broader, deeper dive into a subject that traditionally we don't necessarily talk about, but this is fantastic. This is really helpful to us. This program should be available for downloading, I think, in about a week. But Jillian, can you illuminate on that a little bit, on availability?
Yeah, I would say by the end of the week it will be available on the website. Okay,
and that's www.schinner.com/AE Risk Management. You should also be aware, for those of you still on the call, that we have 2 more webinars as part of this spring webinar series that qualify for HSW Continuing Education. The next one will be, it's continuing to build off of our theme of the business of design. It will be on May 10th, entitled The Business Implications for the 2017 Changes to AIA Documents, Part 1B101. And that will be hosted by our very own Frank Musica, so we're looking forward to that. And that concludes today's webinar. Thank you all for joining us today. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you.